You're listening to TravCon TV, hosted by TravCon. My name is Dylan Callier, and I'm a traveling physical therapist best known for the New Medical Nomads podcast. I'm sitting down with TravCon speakers to give you a sneak peek into what they'll be talking about in the conference this year. My next guest is an RN and the Vice President of Clinical Services at Randstad Healthcare. She's responsible for the overall management of clinical quality and compliance and an absolute wealth of knowledge in the industry. She has over 20 years of experience in the medical staffing industry, as well as over 10 years of clinical nursing experience. She is one of our own TravCon committee members and also one of my favorite Gryffindors. Her next session, Strategies to Avoid a Cancellation, is coming up September 26th to the 29th, 2021 in Las Vegas. Ladies and gentlemen, Melissa Knybel.
Hi, Dylan.
Hi, Melissa. How's it going?
Great.
Welcome on to the Travel, Nursing, and Allied Life podcast. And you are coming up and speaking at TravCon this year. And I just wanted to introduce you to the listeners, and we'll get into what you're talking about in a quick tip. But how did you jump into the staffing industry? I know like most people's stories, they kind of just stumble into it. Is this something that you always planned on getting into, or what's your background?
Yeah, I think like most of us in staffing, we somehow stumble into this industry. Something I'd never thought of before as a career choice at all. But I was working as a registered nurse in the ICU, and I'd been there about 10 years. And like a lot of us experience when you're working in the same setting, you have a tendency to run into burnout issues. So I was certainly at that point. So I was looking for different opportunities to just see a different work setting, work in a different environment, work with different people, just to kind of stave off that burnout. And so what I ended up doing is signing up with a local agency in town. It was a per diem agency at the time, and started a conversation with the woman that ran that branch. And it just so happened she had the exact same background as I did. She was an RN from ICU. And I said, how the heck did you get this job? And so she told me her story. And, long story short, I ended up working a couple shifts here and there, still not completely being able to alleviate myself of the burnout. And lo and behold, about 6 months later, and of course, this will date me when I say this, but I responded to an employment ad in the newspaper to be a branch manager of a staffing company opening up a brand new branch in my area. So that's how I fell into it. It ended up being a good fit. I could use my nursing background to sell my services to the local hospitals and different healthcare facilities in my area, so I could talk the talk. And I understood what their needs were. And then from there, I just kind of grew in my career and started in travel nursing and became, operational or educator or whatever the need was for my business at the time. And I ended up being with the same company now. It's over 20 years. So I celebrated my 20th year anniversary last year.
Wow, congratulations. And wow, yeah, fast forward 20 years. And yeah. You've spoken at TravCon before in multiple years. How many years have you spoken at TravCon?
I think this will be my 7th year.
Wow.
Yep. So I started speaking when the event was much smaller. I think the first event I spoke at was maybe like between 500 or 600 attendees came, and we had very little allied representation at the time. It was mostly nursing. And I just created just a great rapport with the TravCon team. They're a great bunch of people that volunteer a lot of their time. And I just really enjoyed speaking at the Travelers Conference and meeting so many nurses from across the country.
Oh, that's awesome. Melissa, I've sat in several of your talks, and what I enjoy most about your talk specifically is I feel like most in this industry, they get involved and they kind of know how they do things. So if you're talking with somebody who works at a certain staffing agency, how they do things. If you're talking with a traveler who's only worked with one staffing agency, how they do things. But you have a really broad area of knowledge, really big breadth. of how this industry works, how different players interact with each other, communicate with each other. And so it's always been a very, very informational session whenever I sit down and watch yours. What are some of the sessions that you'll be talking on at TravCon this year?
Well, typically it's very common for me to speak about problem resolution, as well as avoiding terminations in your contracts. And some occasions I'll also speak on avoiding medical malpractice, so avoiding those kinds of issues. And the reason why the team chooses me to speak on those topics is because one of the primary things that I do in my role with Randstad Healthcare is actually help healthcare professionals through problems. So if we get complaints from a client, or if a nurse is having some difficulty on the assignment, that's when I get involved to try and help resolve what the issues are, help either the performance to be corrected, or help communicate maybe what the feedback is that the client has about somebody's performance.
Got it. Wonderful. Well, what would be one tip, without giving away your whole presentation, one tip that you would love travelers to know in that area?
Well, typically when it relates to doing a good job on a contract and avoiding an unexpected contract termination, over and over again, when I've had conversations with healthcare professionals, the overwhelming feedback when I have to explain that somebody's contract has been terminated has been, well, if they just told me, I didn't know, right? So it's a weird dynamic when you're a traveler, right? You are at a work site where you actually are not their employer. And I think if I'm going to give one piece of advice, it's never forget, no matter how long your contract is or how many years that you've been traveling, never forget that you are a guest in somebody's house. So just like you would never make assumptions when you're a guest at a friend's house or something like that, you always want to maintain that kind of professional relationship as if you were a guest in somebody's house. And then you have to also remember that because of this weird dynamic, whether that hospital is not really your employer or that contract is not really your employer, you have to remember that they're not always comfortable giving constructive feedback. Even in the normal dynamic of employee and employer relationship, so many times managers don't do a great job with providing you with feedback to let me know what I'm doing good and what I'm not doing so great, right? It's even worse. Augment that by 10 when you're a traveler, right? So the one tip that I would give every single person, every single traveler, is be proactive. Ask for feedback. Assume that they are going to have some feedback for you. Regardless of how many assignments you've done, how many different hospitals you've worked at, you can't assume, because honestly, you are an expert. You, as a traveler, you absolutely are an expert. And most of the time, a higher level expert than some of the staff that you're going to be working with, bar none. However, you also need to recognize that as a guest in somebody else's house, you got to do it their way, right? So you have to make sure you ask them for that feedback, and ask in a way that is an open-ended question. So let's take us all back to our psych rotation, right? Don't allow them to say, oh, you're doing good, you're doing bad, and a yes, no type of answer. Make them give you feedback by asking, what feedback do you have for me? I've just completed my 3 days of orientation. It's really important that I do a good job for you. What feedback that do you have for me to make sure that I can work on that and make sure I do a good job for you? I can tell you, I can honestly tell you that even for the most curmudgeonly manager that you might ask that question of, they are going to look at you with brand new eyes and appreciate the fact that you are asking for feedback. I can honestly tell you they will always give you feedback, right? And if for some reason they can't come up with something specific, right, they'll be more open to giving you that feedback in the future. So if maybe you did make a mistake and you didn't know, or you didn't follow policy exactly to the letter and you didn't know, they're more likely to approach you instead of your agency to say, that one's got to go. She can't follow the policies and procedures. So hopefully I didn't give it too much away. I got a lot more tips other than that, but I would encourage you to definitely come and attend our sessions. Looking forward to seeing everybody in 2021.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Melissa. Oh, that is such a good tip. Communication, relationships, the longer I'm in this, the more I realize that that is what this industry thrives on, and that's how you become a successful traveler. So
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for those tips, and we will be looking forward to seeing your session this year at TravCon.
Excellent. Thanks, Dylan.
Thanks for listening to TravCon TV. You can find the full show notes below or at travcon.org. Leave us a comment on what you would like to hear or email us at podcast@travcon.org.